All right, I want you to think real quickly if you had to pick one person that started the chain of events that led to American independence. Who'd you choose? Did you say this guy? Yeah, probably not. Let's talk about him. Okay, so if we're doing like cause and effect history, there's probably anywhere from 20 to like 100 people that we probably could say started the chain of events that led to American independence. However, this guy, Chief Pontiac of the Ottawa tribe, was a key figure in the chain of events that led to America declaring independence from Great Britain. Alright, so if you remember back to the last episode, we talked about the French and Indian War. We talked about how England and the colonists defeat the French and the Indians and gain control of pretty much the eastern half of North America. And this is a huge deal both for the British, who have just defeated the French in their global war, and for the American colonists, who now have the right and the ability to go and settle west of the Appalachians in that coveted Ohio River Valley. However, if you remember from the last video, the third party that we talked about, the Native Americans, now are 100% against the British colonists. And in order to keep the British colonists from moving further and further west into the frontier, into the Ohio River Valley, Chief Pontiac of the Ottawa tribe leads an attack on Fort Detroit in modern-day Detroit, Michigan. This also takes place at the same time as other Indian tribes attacking different forts near their ancestral lands. This whole chapter in American history is called Pontiac's Rebellion, and eventually the British have to send troops in again just to stabilize the situation between the colonists and the Indian tribes that are fighting against the frontier settlers. Pontiac's Rebellion was a huge deal both to the British and to the American colonists at this time. The American colonists felt that they were entitled to move into the Ohio River Valley and into other areas of the frontier that they had rightfully won from the French and from the Indians in the French and Indian War. The British were okay with this so long as it didn't create any problems for them. Pontiac's Rebellion was just the problem that the British wanted to avoid. They don't want to have to defend the colonial settlers from these Native Americans, and so this creates kind of a point of tension between the two groups as they seek to settle west in the American frontier. The British government seeks to solve this problem by issuing the Proclamation of 1763. And the Proclamation of 1763 basically says that American settlers cannot go west of the ridgeline of the Appalachian Mountains. Well, one of the problems with this was there were already American settlers living west of that ridgeline. And secondly, like, good luck enforcing that from thousands of miles away. Americans are going to do what Americans are going to do. That's kind of why this whole country got started. However, the seeds had been sown, and now you have American colonists that start to think of Britain as an oppressive mother country that's telling them what to do. And that's probably because Britain is being an oppressive mother country, telling its colonists what to do. The British also at this time issued the first of two quartering acts. The quartering act said that any British troops could basically commandeer or choose to stay in a colonial house and expect to be fed, housed, and in some cases even clothed by the colonials at no cost to the British government whatsoever. Obviously, this is a huge infringement on individual liberty, and the colonists took it that way as well. And this was really just even the first two things in a huge line of injustices that the colonists would face at the hands of the British. But let's look at why the British actually enacted these injustices. Alright, so if you remember, the British just finished a global war against the French. And the Treaty of Paris, while it gave Britain a lot of land and a lot of new places to colonize and include into their mercantilistic economy, it also created lots of debt for them. It cost a lot of money to defeat the French, and the British actually borrowed pretty heavily in order to defeat their rivals. So now the name of the game was paying back those debts and trying to decrease the national debt as much as it can, because the national debt for England definitely doubled during this time of conflict with France. So one of the ways that the British sought to make that money up was by taxing all their possessions and also by taxing the American colonies. Now, the British have been taxing the American colonies for some time now, except they never really enforced it. Kind of like when the teacher says get your homework done and then you know that the teacher's not going to check, so you don't do your homework, and you know everything's fine as long as the teacher doesn't check. Alright, well now the teacher is checking homework and the colonists don't like the results. And the series of events that follows from here is actually a huge encroachment on the individual liberties and the group liberties of the colonies in North America. Now remember, most of these either are English immigrants or they're direct descendants from English immigrants, all of them holding individual liberty in high esteem going all the way back to 1215 with King John at Runnymede. When England comes in with a heavy hand enforcing all these new policies, the colonists get pretty bristly and pretty salty pretty quick. One of the first things that the British government does is they issue these things called writs of assistance. One major problem between England and America during this mercantile system, while America still belonged to the British, was the fact that there was smuggling going on. England either forbade outright or taxed very heavily any sort of trade with any countries outside of the British Dominion. Therefore, smuggling was a very common practice in the American colonies. If you wanted exports from France or from Spain or from any of their possessions, you had to go about these by less than legal means, we'll say. And these writs of assistance were basically official permission slips given to British officials, and they could look wherever they wanted in the colonies for smuggled contraband. So this led to the arrest and prosecution of several smugglers. Another thing that was a huge problem for the American colonists is that any smuggler that was captured was going to be tried in British court as opposed to an American legal system. And so the writs of assistance was another big violation of American liberties, even though they were engaging in the illegal act of smuggling. The American colonists basically saw smuggling as a necessary evil, and the prosecution of that crime by the British was hypocritical to them. Next, we see the British taxing sugar and molasses, two things that were pretty heavily featured in the American diet, and still are today, I'll have you know. Don't mess with our sugar. We consume a lot of sugar here in the States. But probably like the biggest thing, the one that really got the ball rolling, okay? Obviously the Proclamation of 1763 was a big one. The Quartering Act also did not sit well. The Sugar Act, the writs of assistance, none of these were liked. But the English done messed up when they enacted the Stamp Act. What was the Stamp Act? Well, the Stamp Act was basically a tax on any sort of official document. And it was a stamp that had to be purchased in order for that document to have any legal bearing. And this Stamp Act mostly affected two groups of people that would eventually be very outspoken with their displeasure with the British. Those two groups of people were newspaper printers and lawyers. For real, England, these aren't the two groups that you want to be mad with you. The people who understand the law inside and out, and then the people who print about the common events of the day. Obviously, this does backfire against the British pretty bad. It wasn't so much the actual taxes that the colonists are getting upset about, because again, they've had these taxes with Great Britain for some time now. It's the fact that they were not being represented in the British Parliament. They felt they should have a say in all these different laws that were being passed in a legislature that was thousands of miles away. Now, the British would counter that by saying, as English subjects, you are represented, because any Englishman that represents anyone in Parliament is representing all British subjects anywhere. It's during this time that you see the phrase, no taxation without representation, start to echo through the colonies, and people start echoing back, no taxation without representation. 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 All right, you get the idea. The colonists were upset about being taxed without having a representative in Parliament, so let's move on. So what did the actual colonists do about this? This is one thing to complain, but like, what actions are they taking in order to right this wrong? And this is where you see a huge difference between the American independence movement and other independence movements or other revolutions in world history. Many of the British colonists here, because they were British citizens, sought to solve their political problems through the political routes that were given them. And a deaf ear was turned to them by the British government. Did they actually then choose to provoke and instigate an armed conflict as a war? So one of the first groups that you see popping up here during this time in between the French and Indian War and the American War for Independence is a group known as the Sons of Liberty. And the Sons of Liberty were any number of different people. They were led by men like Samuel Adams, and they had various founding fathers amongst their membership. And really, they were like a political organization that sought to bring awareness to the fact that they were being mistreated by the English. Now, this is not to say that everything that was done by the Sons of Liberty would fall within the commands that are given to us Christians in Romans chapter 12 and 13, as many of them did actually resort to violent intimidation of British officials. However, the Sons of Liberty did kind of move that movement forward, and they brought the idea of representative government to the forefront of the conversation in the colonies at this time. In fact, men like Samuel Adams sought to petition the British government, and they formed the Stamp Act Congress in direct result to the Stamp Act. And they sent a petition to the British government stating that they were loyal to the king, but they felt they were not given the same rights as other British subjects were throughout the British Empire. And another response that many of these colonists had to the perceived oppression of the British was to form what is known as committees of correspondence. Basically, think of this as like the social media of the day. There was no Facebook to post your complaints on and share your cat videos. There was no Snapchat, there was no Instagram, there was no way to get your political views out on Twitter. There were no blogs, there was nothing. There was no 24-hour news network. All they had was newspaper, all they had was the written word. And so these committees of correspondence pop up between many different towns, and it's a network now that shares information about the American independence movement. And these committees of correspondence would sound the alarms to one another about different injustices being performed by the British government against the colonists. It's almost like all of these complaints fell upon deaf ears in the British government because they responded by doing more of what made the colonists mad in the first place. They passed more acts that cranked down even harder on smuggling, which resulted in the American colonists boycotting British goods, which led to more smuggling, which led to more cracking down on the smuggling, and things were not going well here in this relationship. Due to the perception of the growing unrest in the colonies, the British government also ends up sending more troops to the colonies, and they're being quartered in homes all throughout the colonies. We're talking in the city of Boston, people have to give up beds in their house that their family sleeps in to British soldiers. And this is happening in Boston, it's happening in Philadelphia, it's happening all the way down in Charleston. All of these things are taking place, and the American colonists are becoming more and more upset with the British government. Well, it doesn't take long for this to get ugly. The British troops in Boston were harassed all the time. They would be booed when they marched down the street. People would throw snowballs at them, and people would treat them very poorly. One day, while being harassed by a large mob of colonists throwing snowballs and rocks and other things that you probably don't want thrown at you, the British troops actually fire into the crowd, and when the smoke had cleared, 5 colonists were killed by British bullets. While the details surrounding this skirmish are very unclear, it was used by the colonists to galvanize more Americans to the cause against British oppression. It's known in history as the Boston Massacre. While as news of the Boston Massacre travels throughout the 13 colonies, again, this fervor against British oppression continues to be stoked and continues to grow. In yet another unbelievable step of British oppression, the British government then starts to tax the tea in the colonies. Now, the colonists are British by descent, and so tea was a very important part of their lives. And this taxing on the tea didn't necessarily make it more expensive, but it was the idea that if the king can tax tea, he can tax life itself. He can tax the air that I breathe. And so the colonists begin to boycott British tea. In fact, a bunch of British tea sails in, well, the tea doesn't sail into the harbor, that'd be silly. And when these ships show up in Boston Harbor, the colonists tell the governor to tell the ships to turn around. When the governor refuses to tell the ships to go, that they don't want the tea, several colonists dress up like Indians. Probably not to disguise themselves, probably because they always thought the headdresses looked cool or whatever. And they dress up as Indians, and they go on board these ships in the night, and they dump the equivalent of what would now be $4 million worth of tea into the Boston Harbor. That's a lot of tea. And the Boston Tea Party quickly becomes a symbol of American resistance to British oppression, and it further encourages Americans to take up offense against their mother country. Okay, so you have the American displeasure with Great Britain. You have the chance of no taxation without representation. You have the Boston Massacre. Then you have the Boston Tea Party, where lots of your profit are dumped into the tea. If you're the British government, you have a problem on your hands. You've got some unruly colonists that, quite frankly, you've got to deal with. And so the last step in the British attempt to quell the colonial resistance, and again, Britain's just trying to pay for their wars, man. And this war that they fought was actually a war that had to be fought because the American colonists couldn't take care of the Indians, couldn't take care of the French. They were settling where they weren't supposed to be settling. And so the British feel like they're totally justified in their actions. The Americans feel like they're totally justified in wanting to be represented. And you have two sides that are not going to see eye to eye, and eventually it leads to conflict. And the main catalyst for this, at the end of all these events, at the end of Pontiac that we started the video with, that seems like a long time ago. We talked about Pontiac's rebellion. We get what's known in history as the Intolerable Acts. And the Intolerable Acts are, in a word, intolerable. The colonists did not like them at all because the British introduced some very draconian measures to the American colonies, specifically on the city of Boston. They shut down the port, shut down the harbor. No more goods can sail in or out of Boston Harbor. They sent British troops into every major city to act almost as like a peacekeeping force. They step up the quartering act, so there's more British troops being housed in colonial homes, which doesn't make anybody happy. And then they pass what's known as the Quebec Act, which extends extends the southern boundary of Canada down into the Great Lakes region. People are upset about that. It takes away colonial autonomy in the region, and it also is more tolerant of Catholicism, which is something that goes against a lot of the Great Awakening principles that we talked about a few episodes later. So the Intolerable Acts are intolerable, and you have some groups of people in the colonies, like the Sons of Liberty, like the Committees of Correspondence, that are calling for drastic action, and that drastic action is going to take place in our next episode. So I hope to see you then. Thanks for checking us out today. Hey, if you're still watching this video, why don't you give it a like? You made it this far. Come on. You can do it.